Welcome to a new vision of reality, TSK for the 21st century, our new series on the time-space knowledge vision. TSK starts from the radical suggestion that deep, open-ended, sustained inquiry into time, space, and knowledge, as fundamental facets or elements of our being, can have a profoundly transformative impact on our ways of being and knowing in the world. Many in our time, as we are moving into the third decade of the 21st century, feel that we're caught up rather surprisingly in various crises of meaning and sense-making. And I've long felt that TSK is powerfully resonant with and relevant to the various integral, metamodern, and other communities attempting to address these crises. So I wanted to open up a series where we could explore TSK retrospectively, considering its origins and intentions, and prospectively, in light of what wisdom and ways of working it might offer us going forward. For the 8th episode of A New Vision of Reality, I'm happy to welcome Adrian Roman, a community builder, poet, TSK student, and mindfulness instructor. Well, good morning and welcome, Adrian.
Good morning to you too.
Yeah, happy to be with you this morning and have a chance to talk about TSK. For a while, I've been, for most of the series, I've been talking to the OGs of TSK, people who've been there right from the beginning. So I really wanted to speak to people who've gotten into it more recently and find out what your experience is and what your interests are. And I know you've been working with the Nyingma Institute and also now currently with the Mangalam Center. Both of them are organizations associated with Tarthang Tulku. And I'd like to talk to you about that experience a little bit later. But first, I just want to know if you could say anything about yourself. Let us know some of your background, maybe what led eventually to you joining communities like that. You know, what kind of spiritual experiences or philosophical interests have you had growing up, or have there been any events that strike you as particularly influential or formative in these areas?
Yeah, it's interesting, like what moments were formative. They're mostly formative in hindsight. I'm like, oh, that probably influenced my decision. But I can't say there was really a moment that happened that I was like, oh, I have to study Tibetan Buddhism. But a little bit about my background. I'm Cuban and Chilean. I was born in Miami. I studied human resources and philosophy in college. And then right after college, I moved into the Nyingma Institute and was a full-time volunteer for a short time. And then I was like in and out and in and out. And I'll talk about that a little more. But I think maybe an interesting piece is how, like, what led me to the Nyingma Institute. Yeah. Since I was young, I've been kind of debating with, I had a lot of Christian friends growing up, and I considered myself atheist at the time. This is like high school. And I had a lot of debates with those friends, like, wait, why would this happen if this? So I was always, I guess, interested in religion and kind of the, I guess, metaphysical. And then when I was in college, I was studying philosophy and human resources, which was really a business degree. And as soon as I entered college, I was like, I was good at math. And I just thought, like, this is what I have to do. I study this business and I get a job. And then the more I started studying philosophy, I was studying, my professor's name was Timothy Stock, and he focused on existentialist philosophy. And I remember just feeling some strange sensations in his class, kind of like I was getting lightheaded is a simple way to explain it. But it was like a pleasant feeling. And so I really enjoyed being in the class. Like the material was so true. I just like felt like, oh, like this is what's real, not, these business studies or something like that. And so when I was about to graduate, I went up to one of my professors, my philosophy professors, and I told them, like, I don't think I can work in a business to pay my bills, to just have my home so that I can work. And I was like, it just feels kind of meaningless. Like, I can't do that. And I was kind of in like a crisis. Maybe he could tell, but I couldn't tell at the moment. And he was like, I went to a conference in Berkeley recently at the Mangalam Center, and they have these residential programs where you live there and you work there and you study, Buddhism. And I didn't know much about Buddhism at the time, but he said something like, yeah, and you have to take your shoes off before you go inside. And I remember that was a big deal for me. I was like, oh, that sounds very different. Maybe I should explore something that's really different. And then, yeah, I guess I'm remembering a bunch of moments that kind of made me more comfortable with that idea of moving into a Buddhist community. Like, I met a Tibetan monk by chance. I was playing frisbee with a friend, and two Tibetan monks walked by, and I decided to ask them if they wanted to play with us, and they did. We played frisbee for a little bit, and later on in the day, we were driving, my friend and I, and we saw them, and it was late at night, and so we pulled over, and we are like, what are you guys doing? Like, are you okay? And they were lost. We don't know where our house is. We're here just visiting. Can you help us? So we put them in the car, and somehow they didn't speak English and we didn't speak Tibetan, but we made it to their house somehow. And so that memory was in my mind when my teacher told me about this Buddhist community. I was like, oh, I like Tibetan Buddhist monks, so maybe I'll like that community. It's a lot of backstory, but anyway, so I end up applying for this residential position at Nyingma Institute, and I go there and I arrive. And that's when they have classes that they offer. So I took meditation, TSK, Kumye, and different teachings that they have. But that's when I first started taking TSK classes, which was January 2014. And that's the beginnings. Maybe I can stop there and let you come in.
Great. Yeah, and I really enjoyed hearing that background, and it made me recall similar kinds of events in my life that seemed serendipitous and also playful like that, especially with the Tibetan monks. I recall many years ago, I lived in the desert Southwest, and I was driving across the countryside, and I saw a monk in robes and a bald head walking down a desert road in the middle of nowhere. And I decided to stop and find out what's going on with him. And first, he was a little bit shy and resistant to talk and not very interested in vehicles. He wanted to be on foot. But when he found out really how far he was from anything, and yeah, I eventually made a connection with him and ended up becoming a guide for him for several days throughout the region. And he was a Japanese tantric Shingon Buddhist monk who was visiting the desert Southwest. He'd heard there was good places to meditate there, so I was able to take him to a few of those places. But one of my first, not my very first, but one of my first meetings with a Tibetan monk that was meaningful and lasting for me, I encountered him rolling in the dirt with a dog, just wrestling and laughing. So I think of the similar playful thing with you and playing the frisbee with them. So those were good connections. So in getting into the work at Nyingma and taking up your studies there, Was there anything in particular that attracted you about TSK when you first encountered it?
I would have to say it was the teacher. It was with Ken McKeon, who
Mm,
you know, and he just had a very like, he would look at me like just like wonderment was his personality.
mhm.
He just wondered what I was thinking, and when we did a practice, he would ask us to share, and I would share, and he would just be like, "Whoa!" And that was just like it was the juxtaposition of like the meditation class where it was very kind of formal. It felt nice for me, and so yeah, I think that would be what kind of first drew me to TSK, was the presence of Ken. And also I'll mention in terms of, yeah, I remember one time he had a class, and so I was walking to the class and I was a little early, and maybe like 10 minutes early. So I walk into the room and I couldn't see anything. I just opened the door. But as soon as I opened the door, I felt like this really strong kind of, again, like this lightheadedness. But,
Mm.
you know, I don't like that word because it sounds, but maybe you can understand what I'm saying, like this vibration and I just was surprised,
Mm.
I wasn't sitting doing meditation or anything. I just kind of got slapped in the face with this energy. And then I open the door a little more and I see Ken sitting there, I guess, preparing for class. And so I just joined him and sat down and waited silently for 10 minutes for the class to start. But it was moments like those that really, yeah, I was like, I can't not explore this more. Like, it's too interesting and it feels too real that I had to know what was going on. It was like that.
I think one of my first formal classes in TSK was with Ken also. I'd been
Mm,
studying it for some years on my own, and I had lived with another practitioner and we'd practiced together. But when I went to my first class at the Nyingma Institute, it was with Ken, and it's a delight to be in his presence and to feel his style and his own kind of transmission of that
mhm,
uh, really comes through. In working with TSK over the, I guess several years probably that you've been exposed to it since 2014, right? So that's been a while. Are there any practices that have stood out? Any sets of practices or inquiries that have been enjoyable or meaningful for you?
over the past year with with COVID and um, racism coming more to the forefront, and kind of how to work with that in our organizations, like all of the systemic pains.
Hmm.
Um, there's a practice, it's called Gateway to Presence. It's exercise 12 in dynamics of time and space. we were I was in a class with Jack, and he used that practice in this context that we're talking about. And yeah, I could really identify with it at the moment. And those pains are still around. They might just always be around, like in my lifetime. And so I liked that practice. I thought it was nice to meet someone maybe where they are. And so I appreciate that practice. It also doesn't hide from like what pain is. And I think that's nice, because a lot of meditation that I encounter is about like, let's feel good, you know? And so this allowed me to like just feel how I'm feeling, which might be, disappointed. Um, and then another practice that I'm feeling these days, which is not like a formal practice, at least I don't know, maybe you could tell me, is just like feeling when there's a paradox, and just like noticing what that sensation is. Like, I'm trying to think of a good example, but maybe sometimes if I get a sensation that's very spacious, I might think, oh, I don't know, someone is communicating with me from afar. And also maybe it's not the case. Maybe I'm just feeling, I don't know, really spacious. Yeah, so I don't really have the best example, but kind of when maybe a few things can be the truth, and that feeling of a little bit of confusion, but a little bit of like wonderment, and just kind of staying with that, um, and playing that out. Like, I don't have to choose which one's real. I can just stay with both of them. That's been something I've been practicing lately. Um, that kind of came out of this TSK. There's a little TSK group that I go to once a week these days. And yeah, it kind of came out of that group.
Yeah, just sitting right there with the tensions and not moving away from them, but being present to them, right? Where you can feel multiple possibilities at once and resisting or just not following the instinctual urge we might have to try to resolve in one direction or another prematurely, right? The way that Jack works in his teaching uh, is that TSK has a lot of formal exercises, but Jack likes to just take a sentence here or there and transform it magically into a practice. So I can imagine that growing out of just him pulling a line, from here or there, because really, I think that's one of the gifts that I've experienced with working with TSK and the teachers of TSK is how basically any little thing can become an avenue towards inquiry and to looking deeper into reality and into what's present.
Yeah, and Jack in particular is definitely a wizard with the words, for sure.
Yes, yeah. Before we move on from this kind of discussion, I was thinking back to your earlier description of your time in the philosophy class, and just was curious. Do you know particularly what kind of philosophies or thinkers or subjects were being explored in that class that stood out for you, that maybe helped give rise to that spacious and light feeling for you?
Yeah, at that, I remember the moment I'm talking about, and we were talking about Kierkegaard, who's not a Buddhist thinker. He's I don't want to, anyways, he's Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
And he was saying something, the teacher was saying something around, it's like moving backwards towards the light. That's the sensation of having faith in, in TSK language, you could say having faith in the unknown and staying with the unknown, which is what we're just kind of talking about, this tension and not choosing. And so the teacher was talking about, yeah, having faith is like moving backwards towards the light. So, and when he said that, and he was behind me moving backwards, he was really theatrical, this teacher, which was nice. And in that moment, it's like, was the teacher feeling that feeling so strongly that I felt it too? Or did I just understand it? Or, what was happening, and just kind of holding those possibilities as real and not real. Yeah, it's a practice for me.
Kierkegaard has been coming up in a number of our conversations on this channel recently, so I'm
Oh, really?
appreciating your reference. He definitely has I think there's a good connection to what we were just talking about too, because he definitely has a real appreciation for paradox. For
Mm,
he's working within Christian existential tradition, but he nevertheless, I think, has a real instinct for the depths and opening up to the paradoxes beneath the superficial platitudes and things of traditional religion.
yeah.
um, yeah, so that's great. Do you have any kind of, apart from the full presence mindfulness, which I want to talk about, but right now, do you have any regular TSK practice? It sounds like maybe going to a group. You're doing a group practice regularly.
Yeah, I have, there's a group that I meet with weekly, and we just it's kind of developed into like an open dialogue about, it's doesn't always revolve around TSK. It's just kind of about life with the lens of TSK. And so it's been really nice for me. And then I also I'm taking Jack's class. He's teaching a class called Adventures in Knowledge. So I'm taking that's weekly as well. And I just, when I wake up, not every day, but I'll sit for a little bit and read. These days I'm reading what the class is asking us to read, Jack's class. But before that, I was looking at Jack's book, When It Rains, the Space Get Wet. And he kind of lays out very systematically some things, which is nice for me, because I've been kind of just studying here and reading this, and kind of, it feels random how I've been studying TSK. And so going through it in that systematic way, I think will be nice to kind of have a more full picture of something.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's, and I'll say just kind of my life, I'm just always thinking about things in this way. If I'm having a conversation with my girlfriend and I have some spaciousness in the middle of the conversation, like I'm witnessing that.
Mm-hmm.
Or I might have a conversation with a friend who knows something about TSK, who's read the book, so we might talk about it. So it's just all over.
It's nice, both I think, to work systematically through the book sometimes, and other times just to be present with whatever's there, and sometimes even just randomly pick up a book and find a passage in it that might speak to us. I worked a while ago with When It Rains, Does Space Get Wet, and I had it sitting on my bed, and my son was young at the time, and he walked in and he saw that book and he said, "Of course not." He said, "Why'd you waste all your money on that big book? I could have told you in 2 seconds."
That's good. That's funny.
So I know Jack has been developing a practice that's kind of a gateway to TSK, but also connects to, I think, broader interests in the culture and mindfulness and other secular approaches to meditation. So I have not done anything with the full presence mindfulness material yet. Could you say anything about what it is and what your experience of it has been so far?
I'm not sure that Jack would say that FPM is a gateway to TSK. I think he would say that it's a path on its own. And when you study FPM, there are 3 modules, main modules. Yeah, so the first module is, trying to remember his titles, but maybe I'll just say the first module is like grounding, the grounding practices and kind of sensation. The second module is about thinking and stories and how to kind of incorporate that into your practice. And then the third module is on something that he calls intention. But I think one way to describe it is that it's not your intention. It's kind of like you meet monks playing frisbee, and then your teacher tells you about this place that he happened to go to, and then you apply to this place, and now you're studying Tibetan Buddhism. Like, what is the intention of your life, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
and how to be awake to it. Yeah, I'm like, Jack will watch this so he can adjust if needed. Um, so those are the three modules. And then after that, like if you're saying, because it was designed to be a teacher training as well. And so, okay, you've done the three modules, you'd like to teach the material. Then the next three modules, advanced modules, we study the TSK book a lot. And kind of like, this is the TSK material behind module 1 of FPM. This is the TSK material behind module 2, behind module 3. And so, is it a gateway? It certainly helped me understand TSK in a different light. But I think maybe one of his goals is so it can have its own legs as well. So let me see if there's, do you have any questions specifically about FPM? Or maybe I could just think if there's something special to say.
Yeah, no, that's clarifying for me because I wasn't sure exactly what its relationship to TSK was. I knew that there was some connection and some informing of the vision by TSK, but it makes sense that he's also developing something that will stand on its own. What kind of practices and things do you do?
So one practice is, so in the first module, we're doing practices with the senses. So breathing, hearing, seeing, and I think you could say just hearing, just seeing, just breathing. And the reason that just is in there is because when we're hearing something, like I actually live right next to a highway. And so I hear the car pass by, and just in me telling you, I'm hearing the car pass by, there's a lot in that one moment, like, so in just hearing the practice, we're kind of noticing the different dimensions of the experience. And we're not trying to stop the labeling, which is what I tried to do at first. And I think which is pretty common for people to want to do. Like, I don't want to think, I need to just be, and I am just supposed to hear. So let me stop the labeling. I don't think that's really what's happening. I think we're just noticing that there are different realities or dimensions to the experience. And so in noticing, I think that creates spaciousness on its own. And so you do the same thing with the seeing. You kind of parse out the dimensions and how we operate naturally. And yeah, so those are some of the beginning practices. And then in the second module, you would do just thinking. And so how do you notice your thoughts coming up? And then also you have this kind of like, Jack just calls it like, what does it feel like to think? What is the thinking element? And so just with the practices that are very helpful, getting more comfortable with those layers. And then I think over time, it just kind of develops like a natural spaciousness with hearing or thinking.
It's really interesting. Have you ever read the work of or heard of David Michael Levin? David Michael, sometimes Kleinberg Levin?
No.
He actually knows Rinpoche, and he's familiar with TSK and also Buddhism and Dzogchen practice. But he's you could say a continental philosopher. He's American, but he mostly works in the continental tradition. Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and Derrida, and people like that. But he's got really rich, beautiful books. He's one of my favorite philosophers. And he's got a series of books where each one is a meditation on the senses. There's a whole philosophy book about just feeling with the body, a whole book on vision and learning to see in a different way, and another one on hearing or listening and learning to open up listening to greater and greater depths. And he's drawing deeply on philosophy, but behind that is his exposure also to, I think, these kinds of teachings. Eventually, I think at the end of his book called The Opening of Vision, it's a long meditation, mostly within Western tradition. But at the very end of it, he's got an epilogue which describes his experience of going in a Tibetan dark retreat, and basically kind of purifying the visionary capacity, through that experience. So, anyway, just if you're interested in what's unfolding in the FPM, then you might be interested in, especially with the philosophy background, and what he's exploring.
Yes, I will check him out for sure. And you mentioning him, it reminds me, like, when I was studying philosophy, I understood what was being said. I would read it and read it again and be like in awe, really, of like, wow, I can't believe I haven't understood life in this way before. But when I went to Nyingma and started practicing like these Eastern traditions, or in this case, Tibetan Buddhism and TSK, it was a different kind of knowing. I was like, that's what they mean by whatever. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful for the practices it's just like another layer and another layer. And so to hear this gentleman, Michael, what was his name?
David Michael Levin.
David Michael Levin. And how he's kind of like maybe at the intersection. It's nice.
He doesn't have much attention around him anymore, and his books are heavy philosophically. They're not easy to get into, but they're very rewarding. And I think he is walking that border between the deep intellectual inquiry and the embodied felt inquiry of the West and the East.
There's a TSK practice in dynamics that talks about like go into the pain, go into the emotion, and then go into the analytics and analyze again, and then go back in. And it was interesting to hear because this kind of analyzing, I think that, so when I started, and often what I see in other modalities is that we kind of focus on not analyzing. And maybe that's because we're socialized to do that so much that we're just trying to take a break from it. But then I think people assume that we have to take a break from it forever. And, so that's what I appreciate about TSK is that, and FPM is that it incorporates the analytical, it incorporates thinking and stories or what's happening now. And
yeah, I appreciate that about it as well. And I've been in other traditions where they want to typically have you bracket out too much thinking, too much analysis, definitely too much storytelling. And TSK really, there's maybe a tantric element to it in that basically everything's on the table. All of these human capacities are workable and can become part of an overall holistic contemplative practice. Yeah, so you shared with me an essay that you wrote, a really lovely essay. I really liked it, about your experience of coming in as a volunteer to work at the Nyingma Institute and then later with the Mangalam Center. And could you say a little bit about what those places are for the people listening who might not know much about them, and I know we've talked about it a little bit, but just a little bit more about what your experiences um, in them, were, and kind of what led you to into them.
Mhm. Yeah, earlier in our talk, you said that I'm currently working for Mangalam. And so just to clarify, actually, I stopped working for Mangalam the beginning of the year here.
Okay.
So still in communication and, you know, but I don't work with Mangalam anymore. Just to clarify that. There's a lot in the question, so I'm just trying to see where to go into. I'll start with just saying a little bit about each center. So the Nigma Institute is in Berkeley, and the Mangalam Center is also in Berkeley, and they're sister organizations. And you have other organizations in Berkeley and internationally that are all sister organizations and are kind of birthed from out of Tarthang Tulku Rinpoche's vision. And each of the centers has their own mission, their own kind of personality. And so when I first arrived at the Nigma Institute, I lived at the Nigma Institute, but I worked at Mangalam and Jack is the director there. And then after I left the Nigma Institute, I went to Boston for some time. And when I moved back, I worked with Mangalam and I lived outside the community. And maybe that's where I'll start, is when I moved back to Berkeley. At one point, I was talking to Jack and I was like, yeah, I've been getting a lot of jobs, but they always are disappointing in the end. Like it's not really what I want to be doing. And he was like, well, why don't you work here? And I was like, okay, like what do you have in mind? And he was thinking, because of my human resource background, that maybe being involved in a volunteer program, the residential volunteer program, would be good. And at the moment, I don't think that Mangalam had any residential volunteers. Sorry if I'm forgetting someone, but I don't think so. So I was like, okay, I can do the volunteer program. And then as I sat down to kind of think about how to ask people to come, I felt like I had to change the program a little bit for it to be a good language and set up for people to come. Also, part of the hope was, do you think that you could attract a younger crowd, a younger, diverse crowd? And so I was like, then I'll have to change some things. And I think that this process of developing and thinking about mindful living was very informed by TSK. And I think maybe we'll see that as I'm explaining it, but it felt very much like I was just being drawn to different things. Like at the moment, I wasn't really reading about systemic thinking or any of these kind of social justice. I was aware, but it wasn't in my face. And still I was like, what we need to do is we need to kind of make it a little more decentralized. So instead of us telling them what to do, they should come here and kind of decide what they are passionate about and what we need, and they'll know best what to offer the community. And so I started kind of just remembering my experience and my pain points and just incorporating them into like a program. And it just so happened that the shifts were related to a lot of the shifts that were happening in society today. And I kind of found out because I had gone to a training, and the training started talking about some of the things that I was thinking about for the program. I hope I'm not getting too vague, but maybe I'll just pause for a minute.
I know from the article that you mentioned, yeah, finding a more decentralized organization, something that in TSK terms, maybe trusted the knowledgeability of the different members to manifest in their own ways and in ways that are appropriate. In most traditional Buddhist settings, there's kind of a hierarchical, top-down organization and more clear and formal power structures and you know um, lines of instruction and things like that. And TSK is at least foundationally in the texts, it's not like that. It doesn't put forward any set of rules. It doesn't put forward any set of organization, any set of organizational patterns. It doesn't establish any hierarchies. It's pretty much an open source kind of teaching, though it does have teachers and centers around. But there are a lot of different groups also that have spontaneously arisen, and it is decentralized in that way. So it makes sense in some ways that there's a little bit of tension between kind of like ancient, millennia old Buddhist forms of organization and whatever TSK is trying to manifest and trying to, I think, bridge, Eastern and Western sensibilities. So I can appreciate why there's maybe some tension there a little bit, but also some opportunity there. And so yeah, I'd like to hear. I know you've from the article that you've taken some classes in, uh, dialogue and communication and mediation, uh, and that some concerns and focuses around diversity and social justice and making the center and the experience and the organization welcoming to people from diverse backgrounds. So could you say anything more about your experiments there and your discoveries there?
Yeah, I think experiments is a good word, and also a word that became painful towards the end. That this, because people were living here, it was real, but it was also an experiment, and so that became an issue later. But yeah, what I can say is, yeah, there's a line in TSK that says you don't need to hire an agent to work on your behalf. And I don't want to take it out of context, but I kind of interpreted that as like, yeah, you can trust knowledge. And so in that light, we did try to organize in a decentralized way. Of course, Jack was still the director, and so it was kind of a petri dish. It was like the people who came on and myself and Morgan, who's the associate director there, we're kind of trying to exercise how can we do this in a way where you all inform us and we inform each other.
Right.
And we kind of tried to cultivate an emergent space. So that was one goal that we had, and we put structures in place to make that happen. But another important part for me was connecting with the community. Like, how do you really feel intimate connection with the community? Because I think that's important for feeling safe enough to go into these practices, for wanting to stay, and also I think for the age group, having a social connection that's very supportive is really, really crucial. And so some of the practices that we did would be having listening circles, we called them. So once a month we would gather for an hour and a half, and it was a series of like icebreaker type practices and maybe sharing stories and just kind of starting to see each other in a raw way that could help you understand this person as a whole, not just someone who you're working with, because often the community, it's a working community. It easily becomes work oriented, and there's work, but there's also the practice and also like your life. If you have a toothache and you don't have insurance, it's going to affect your work, and it's going to affect your practice. And so they're together.
Mhm.
So we had these listening circles, but we also, before every meeting, we took 5 minutes to do some meditation practice together and maybe ask a question, like a check-in question. And then at the end of the meeting, we'd have like a closing question. And it was just ways to kind of remember each other as humans before we go into the work part of it and work together to accomplish whatever we needed to. So in addition to that, there was a lot of focus on like interpersonal. There was a lot of support for interpersonal issues. For example, like I would meet with people sometimes once a week or bi-weekly, and we would just take a walk and talk. Hey, how's work going? Is everything okay for you? If there was an issue and it was something managerial or systemic, then I would try to adjust that. Or if it was something interpersonal, I might meet with the other person and be like, hey, what do you think is going on here? And try to kind of mediate the conflict so that it was more harmonious and fruitful for them and for me and for everyone. And we really tried to develop that, like, any pain point is a pain point for everyone. It really affects the whole dynamic here. And another tool that we used was feedback. Sometimes we'd gather in a group for feedback, but normally it was written. So if many people had similar pain points, then we would know, maybe we're doing something wrong as the management team. As a community, this is something that we have to shift. And one of the issues there was that, we, again, like, we were a petri dish. So if we all agreed that this could shift, we then had to climb up the ladder and see if it was possible to shift. And it wasn't always. And so, it was complicated. It was a complicated experiment. So that's a little bit about the kind of interpersonal element. And then, yeah, the decentralized element, we had a lot of, like, after people were there for some time, we would have, what do you think should be included in the mission? And so trying to kind of incorporate the new members into what we're doing now and saying, like, you came here for a reason, and we want this work to be meaningful for you too. And so this mission probably encompasses some of what you care about, but is there something that you would add? And then we would kind of collaborate as a group to adjust the mission of the mindful living program. And where we ended, and towards the end, is we really were passionate about social justice issues. We really cared about offering tools of offering, like, emotional regulation tools to activists, for example. That's a little tricky because we want to not put FPM in the emotional regulation box, but it's still helpful for that. And, activists still need that emotional regulation as well. And so that's like an example of one of the projects that we did and wanted to continue with.
Joanna Macy, are you familiar with her?
Yes, I really like her work.
Yeah, so you're aware that early on she discovered that activists are often out front facing tensions in the community and often other focused and not taking time for inner care or inner cultivation, um, and really needed spaces for processing of grief and processing of other difficult experiences and you know engendering greater presence and heartfulness. So she's developed programs around that and exercises around that. But it sounds like you were, from an FPM and TSK context, also beginning to craft something like that, just organically out of what was arising among the members there. Does that feel right?
Absolutely. And, I would meet with Jack and Morgan pretty much weekly to just like, hey, this is what I'm catching with my pulse. What do you think about that? And this, and then so like, Jack and Morgan would kind of like do this, like they had the information of the community as a whole, and also a lot of wisdom from practices. And then I would normally be bringing the information from the ground. This is happening with this person. This is happening with this person. I want to do this, but what do you think about it? And so it just was shaping itself. And it really was, I thought, with more time, it was shaping into a lot of what we're seeing today too, like Joanna Macy's work that reconnects is very, there are some similarities with what we're doing. Or if Adrian Marie Brown's work, she wrote Emergent Strategy. That one really influenced the program as well, because it helped me have language for what I saw happening, because that language wasn't there with the TSK and the FPM. It was like the practices were there and the ability to dissolve limits and be open and feel was there, but the language of like, what does emergence mean and how can we put that in an organization, it hasn't been created yet. And with this vision, so taking and borrowing from emergent strategy, or I did this, yeah, other courses that I've taken really helped inform this program as well.
In this series so far, I want to be careful how I say this because I don't mean anything pejorative about it at all. But in this series so far, all of my guests have been mostly elderly white males, and I'm getting to be one of those too. I'm I'm not knocking that at all. But is there something in maybe in your own work with this? Is there something about the way TSK has been languaged or presented that makes it less accessible to people from other backgrounds, or um, is there anything that and I don't want to put too much pressure on you. I know that you're not holding yourself in a position of authority or over TSK, but just in your experience in working with it and working with other people constructively and collaboratively, what have you found? Are there ways that uh, TSK could be presented that makes it seem more relevant and approachable to a
Mhm.
more diverse group of people?
Yeah, I thank you for how you laid out the question. I think how TSK is languaged is something that Jack was thinking about when he created FPM, among other things. But as far as for diverse people, I think it's more about how it's presented in terms of who's presenting it, and also systematically, or how can I study it? How much do the classes cost? How much does a retreat cost, and where are those retreats happening? Are they happening in Marin, or are they happening in, Knoxville, Tennessee,
Mhm.
for example? So, or Oakland, California. So I'm thinking, and I'll talk about both. One is, maybe I can give an example. I just think representation matters. Like, I went to go get my hair cut yesterday for this interview, and the guy who was cutting my hair was this Puerto Rican man. And just immediately he was like, the way he talked to me was very familiar, and I couldn't even really explain it to you, but it just made me comfortable, and I sat down, and the way that we got to what kind of haircut do you want was very nice for me, and I felt comfortable, and we chatted about spirituality, which is sometimes taboo with other people. And so I think representation matters in the language that you end up using is going to be received better, probably from the people who are like you and who've had experiences like you. And so I think it's important to get TSK teachers who are of different backgrounds. And I think that there should be a large energy to make that happen and support that to happen. But then you have the strangeness of like, do we even want more TSK teachers? Is that something that's desired? Because if it's not, then that doesn't. But I want more TSK teachers, and I can think of a handful of other people who would want TSK to be more alive in our society. So that's one element, is the kind of representation.
Mhm.
And I know that, maybe some efforts are being made for that. And then the other element is like, how can I connect with the material? If I go, for example, the class I'm in now with Jack is, I don't know for sure, but I think almost everyone's over 50. And that's a different environment for me. I have classes that I go to where people are all my age, and it's a very different vibe. And I can ask different kind of questions. I can maybe talk about things that are more relevant to my life right now. Like, what do I do for work? Whereas someone who's 50 might be like, I'm about to retire soon. So we're just in different areas of our life. And so the teaching is going to be speaking to something different. And the same goes with different races, like, there are differences. And those are going to come out from the teacher. Like, what are you going to talk about as a Black teacher today? You might be talking about how to deal with the police. You probably wouldn't be talking about that in another circumstance.
Mhm.
So that's kind of an example of how, like, it's important. Is there any other questions that you have about that? I feel like I'm trailing.
I was just thinking, and it's actually something true in several communities that I'm part of. I'm also part of the integral theory community, and this channel is centered mostly around integral theory and related communities like metamodernism and Game B. All of them are interested in transformative approaches in society, and meeting some of the challenges that confront us systemically, across the board. There's they call it a meta crisis, right?
Mm.
One of the things that is true in the integral communities, um, and metamodern too, is that we find more men coming to the front doing that. Not as many women. Um, if they are there, they tend to, not come forward in terms of public speaking and teaching, and they might study it, but they're not taking those roles on. And there's always a question like, where are the women, and how do we make this more attractive and accessible, and some, to them. In my experience teaching at university, I introduce TSK and some practices from TSK in one of my classes. And I can say from experience of probably 15 years of doing that, every single time I do it, the largest, most enthusiastic response to TSK that I get is from women. It's not something that they would have sought out. It's probably not something that they would have come across if they weren't in that class. But once they experienced it, especially the experiential side and the inquiry side, they were super enthusiastic about it, and also wanting to dive into the philosophical part of it as well. So I noticed just being exposed to it, and maybe in the way that I did it also, it was something that really every single year I get emails from, especially female students. I loved that. How do I do more? Right.
Mm.
And it doesn't seem to be happening more broadly, though, outside of that. In my experience, and I might be wrong about that, but most groups that I've been part of, they're mostly male. And so I don't know what can be done, or, personally, except maybe thinking about where you teach it, where you present it, what context you take it to just give it a chance.
Yeah, what it came to mind pretty quickly was there's this book called The Women Who Run with Wolves.
Mm-hmm.
And some of what it's saying is like intuition has often been pushed aside for women. Like, where are your facts? Where's the science? That intuition is not good enough. You have a bad feeling about that person, sorry, that doesn't change my mind. And so what immediately came to mind is maybe the women felt like, wow, this is really speaking to intuition, and it's something that I've been feeling for so long, but I've been almost told by society that that's not appropriate. So, that's what came to my mind. I was like, oh, maybe they just felt like at home. But it sounds like your question is also like, how can we present the material so that it can benefit more women? Mm-hmm. and more broadly, I think you're saying more diverse groups.
Right.
Yeah, I think that for me, I can give a little bit of one example, but really I think the way to do it is to sit down in a room with the population that you're interested in teaching and create it with them, and just say, hey, let's say you're trying to teach 15-year-old people that are from Latin America. You would sit down in a room with them and maybe say like, hey, I want to like a focus group, and kind of get the feedback from them. Like, what they might say, I really enjoy dancing in my culture. Like, is there any way to incorporate this with movement? Okay, I'll have to think about that. And in addition to that, like, again, putting the energy into training teachers so that you have a trained teacher of that background that can really support this happening. Because there are a lot of dynamics at play, like, it's not just like let them talk more. It's there's a lot more there. So yeah, I would say like we'd have to speak to the population and design it together. But yeah, I think a brief answer would be like representation, so getting teachers, and then affordability. I think cost is often something to think about. And the other thing is safety, and not like always for physical safety, but when you were telling your story, I thought you were going to say overwhelmingly it was the men who responded. And I think that's a kind of dynamic that we have to recognize, like, how can we make the room feel safe for women? Maybe it doesn't feel safe to have to speak, to say something and maybe get ridiculed, or to have to say something and then be spoken over as if what you're saying doesn't matter. Once that happens once or twice, like, that probably doesn't feel good. And it's not a good place to study this kind of thing. So, and in my experience, it happens everywhere, including meditation spaces and Buddhist communities. Like, so we have to figure out, like, yes, we have to speak to the focal group, but we also have to do the work of like, we have to read books, listen to teachers who've already talked about it, and really start to design a space that's safe so that we can bring in this focal group and then inform it even more. It's a long process, and it's going to take a lot of effort. And I think the first question is, do you really want that? Is that your main priority? Because that's what it will have to be. There's a lot of work to do.
Right. Yeah, I think that's well put. I'm jumping out of the interview format, but I just want to share with you a practice that we do in that class. You mentioned just people talking about dancing, so I was just thinking about that. The body, mind, thought interplay practice. Just watching how the interaction of your embodied feelings and your mind and your emotions manifest together to generate a sense of you in a certain context. And so that can be done anywhere, walking or moving. There's a systems theory practice when you're trying to, I do it in the context of a class on living systems theory and learning dynamics of self-organization. And there's a practice where everybody stands in a group and every person picks two people that they have to remain equidistant from. And they can pick them anywhere in the room, but as soon as you start, they have to position themselves to be equidistant from two other people. And so typically we'll start with the body, mind, thought interplay of just milling about the room. And then they'll pick the two people and then they'll move into that kind of movement. And it usually brings out a great deal of liveliness, people laughing as they're all scurrying around and reorganizing. And you can see how it almost settles into a stable pattern and then begins to shift again. But it really brings forward, kind of an embodied sense of how, how systems self-organize, but how, also we are who we are and we become what we become in the context of these kind of shifting relationships. So that's been, fun to explore. And then that's something that the, students have always been very responsive to.
Yeah, that sounds like a very creative way to show that, to transmit that teaching.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile. I think Jack is really good at that, experimenting with different. You know, he'll take the different practices of the walking very slowly and then do variations on that. And I think it there's a lot that we can do to help. I think the practices connect to different people in different ways. Um, that some people will relate more kinesthetically, some more, you know, imaginally, some more emotionally, and how do we exercise all of that? Um, so that we can. I think it's both for holistic human growth, but also to be able to speak to more people through these
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
So earlier I mentioned, the different communities that are represented on this channel and the concern with the meta crisis. And I know in your own work that uh, you know, you're involved in some activism and other things like that. And I saw on your profile that you have at least shared some things about regenerative economics and permaculture and things like that. So I you know, get the sense that you're concerned, broadly with um, different social measures that we can take to bring greater health and stability and anti-fragility and holistic well-being to society. And you know also talking about what we've just been talking about in terms of creating spaces that are safe and that are more open to diverse participation and connecting to real on the ground issues. So in your experience working in these areas, have you found any kind of intersection with TSK that's been fruitful in terms of energizing your own work? Anything that you feel that TSK as a path of inquiry and holistic development could contribute to working better in these areas?
Absolutely. I think I first learned that when, I was studying closely with Jack, the full presence mindfulness and TSK. And then when the information of, systemic theory and social justice started coming in, I was able to receive it. And I can't tell you if it was the TSK or if it was that I just got a little older and, I don't know what, or if I received the right information. But I definitely think that, you know, studying FPM and TSK kind of opened my heart more. I was able to hold more and feel it and not defend so quickly, and be confident that a solution can arise even if I don't know what it is right now. So I'm able to hold like, yeah, I have received a lot of privilege for being white presenting. Like, okay, that's the truth and I can hold that. And what the solution is to that, I don't know yet, but I'm confident that I can get there. And so I think on a personal level, TSK and the vision has helped, and in a maybe a grander scheme. Yeah, I was just talking to Remco, who's another teacher and student of TSK, and he was explaining to me like how the dynamic of time and space practices go, and it's like, pain, you feel the pain or observe what's happening, be okay with the pain, feel the pain, and then like don't label it as pain and just let it be, and then kind of like come up with a solution and then let go of that solution and open it to the unknown. And that's like the layout of the practice, and then you start again. And when he said that to me, I was like, that's really similar to the conflict resolution theory when I studied mediation with Seeds at Oakland. So it's like these practices, and the thing about the theory with conflict resolution is you learn it, but how do you feel that when you're talking to someone and they have a conflict? It's not easy to not go to the solutions. It's really a practice to be like, I have to focus on their pain and feel their pain and tell them that I understand their pain so that they can feel ready to go into a solution. And so I think TSK has practices to offer to really feel in a way that maybe other theoretical explanations don't have. And this is going back to when I said I understood the existentialism, but I didn't know it in this lens. I think it offers this other layer that is so important, which is really like embodying feeling in this way that's unique in our society. I think it's not taught in our society, so we don't know. So that's one thing that it has to offer is really embodying. And actually, there's this big movement happening, at least in the Bay Area, of combining spirituality and activism because activists get burnt out.
Right.
You know, and then you have some cynical person who's like, yeah, you know, I tried, and it sucks to be burnt out. It hurts. You feel bad. You could have helped more, but we didn't get to support that person in the way that they needed. So yeah, there are a lot of people in the Bay Area specifically who are trying to bridge that intersection. And I think TSK could be that spiritual side and incorporate with activism so that we can have more creative solutions, more, yeah, richness everywhere. So yeah, that's one way.
Yeah, I really like that, and I think that's a good note to end on. Actually, I really appreciated what you've shared from your experience and the kind of questions that are alive for you, and I really appreciate your willingness to make yourself vulnerable and experiment with different ways of knowing and to put yourself kind of on the edge of knowledge and what's arising and let yourself be informed by what comes up. I think so. It's wonderful to hear about, and hope we can have further conversations.
Thank you. That's nice to hear. And I appreciate you inviting me to talk here with you. And I have one question for you, if that's okay.
Sure.
You know, I see that you're interviewing all these people for TSK. And yeah, I guess my question is like, are you aware of your intention of why you're kind of drawing these stories out from these people?
I think there are several layers to it. One is I just really have benefited a lot from my exposure to TSK and to a number of the extraordinary people who are working with it. I also see that mostly, in the circles that I move in, that's an underground current. Most people don't come across TSK, or they remember it as something that they heard about back in the 80s or something, and don't know that it's actually still alive and thriving, that there's a lot going on, because TSK is not bombastic or evangelical. It's not dogmatic. It's not putting itself out there and trying to sell itself. It's just quietly spreading, you know, among those who find it useful. And I think that's a very wonderful thing about it. And I don't want to really maybe interfere with that. But I've also noticed maybe there's something going on with TSK that also maybe keeps it a little bit hidden. And I don't know if it's me or not to, it's not really my place to necessarily interfere with that. But I'm curious about that dynamic. And as we've just been talking about in the last, 20 minutes of this conversation, you know, is there something, one, is there wisdom in keeping it kind of like under the radar in the way that it is most of the time? Or are there things that we're not doing that we could do better that could help expose the gifts and the fruits of TSK and this way of thinking to more people? Um, so I'm kind of walking that line with this series, I think, in wanting just to honor what already has been happening and to let more people know about that. So I'm sharing this primarily on my channel, which is me and my partner, Layman Pascal. We are mostly speaking to communities that are interested in very, very many of the things that TSK is about, but most of them don't know TSK. So I wanted a chance to really expose it in that way. But I also, out of my own feeling of benefit from it, I kind of just wanted to do something to honor it, to just in my own way, in my own gesture, to collect um, the wisdom and the insights of people together that can put something there for posterity that's in a little bit different format than the books and other things that have been released so far.
Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate that you're walking on the edge. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for your time and for meeting me today, and look forward to more conversation.